Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
Lots to talk about today. I'm super excited to have this gentleman join us. He is somebody who has made business ethics his life as a professor, a researcher, and so much more. We're going to look at the airline industry today, specifically Boeing, who has been plagued with many challenges over the years, continues to have challenges. How do we frame that from the ethical standpoint connected to business and more? Out of New York City, Ronald Berenbeim joins us today. Welcome back. How are you doing today?
Hi, Steve. How you doing?
Fantastic. This is a topic I feel that its time has come. You can't ignore the elephant in the room when it comes to Boeing and the airline industry and what's been going on, malfunctions, all of that. Where do we begin with this, Ronald?
Well, I think we begin with the crashes, which always attract your attention when they involve airlines. And recently, we had a situation where a particular Boeing model, it was the 787 Max, the door flew off, or maybe it was some other Boeing plane, but in any event, it on an Alaska Airlines flight, and in any event, it turned out the reason for that was that the bolts were not securely fastened, and it brought back memories, not particularly fond ones, of two crashes in a very short period of time that had 356 fatalities in total, and were due to the failure of a new Boeing model, the 787 Max, to adequately adjust altitude. It climbed to a steep altitude because it was, I think, programmed in large measure on a computer, and the pilots were tried to adjust for it by a very steep decline, and those two planes crashed. The airline had developed this new model because it was getting a lot of competition from the 320 Airbus, especially for some fairly short runs like say London to Berlin or something like that. Mid runs, not really short, but mid runs. And so they had a choice between just taking their own old plane and tacking on or developing a new piece of equipment that would account for increases or decreases in altitude and various other things. And the question was whether to design a whole new airplane or to just add what was needed to an older model. And they decided on the second course. Of course, they saved themselves a lot of money. And then we had those two crashes. Then they worked to correct it. Then we had the most recent two incidents. And so Boeing has been in the news almost daily, or perhaps daily, with all sorts of articles and with all sorts of repeats of articles that were published earlier, the in case you forgot articles. So that's where we are now. And what I propose to do is to take the ethics frame that we have used in some of these previous conversations, all of them, in fact, of the sort of economics test, broadly defined, the greatest good for the greatest number, law test, and then the ethics virtue test, as pointing the way towards future handling of this problem, and perhaps ultimately achieving a significant improvement in the situation.
With what's going on, especially the bolt on the doors, and thank goodness that it wasn't a tragedy involved in that. It's almost hard to fathom that, and there's tens of thousands of bolts on the plane. I get it. However, uh, that's a door. That's an access point. It's almost hard to fathom that that wasn't checked and double checked. But Boeing can only rely on their employees, and all of that being said, how does the FAA continue to allow things like this to happen to one company when so much is at stake?
Well, we're going to get to that right away, but let me say at the outset that it goes beyond simply allowing, because one of the issues involved is the FAA's, I won't use the word allow, but it amounts to that, permitted, enabled Boeing to engage in what was called self-compliance, which was basically for certain issues, significant issues, we won't impose any processes on you. We won't double check you. We will engage in what is known as self-compliance, which is that you develop your own compliance rules along with your suppliers, not all of whom work for Boeing. You have various people who build the engine, people build the seats, and so on. And then you just tell us you're satisfied, and we'll take it from there. So that's what happened before the first two crashes. There was what was known as self-compliance. There had been some whistleblowers, I think about 19 of them, that complained about various parts of the manufacturing process. What actually happened was that both of those planes had a sudden ascent, and the pilots, by using their own skills and their own responses, tried to lower the ascent. They did so too quickly, and one writer described it as being like being on a roller coaster. You got to the top, you looked out, and all of a sudden the roller coaster plunged. But there had been no training. Some employees whistleblowers had tried to bring this to Boeing's attention. One of them was in the news last week because he killed himself. And whether that was in response to the latest attention Boeing had received or not, no one knows, obviously, but there were reprints of a whole lot of interviews he had had with various reporters and so on over time, and various complaints he'd made. So this self-compliance issue makes the TAA very much a partner in this whole debacle, and we'll take it from there. Seems like a good time to pause if you have any questions, and then we'll go on.
Well, I think we're at that point now when you use the word self-comply. How would you define that?
Well, basically, it was the TAA saying to Boeing, well, here is a form, you sign it. Perhaps there were some boxes they had to tick. Did you do this? Did you do that in terms of your compliance checks? And that was it. There was no independent verification of a product quality manufacturing process or whatever those questionnaires were meant to answer.
So it's on Boeing to comply in their own way. I mean, the checking the boxes doesn't make an air traveler feel super confident knowing the door can fall on.
The air traveler, doesn't necessarily know that. does not necessarily know the compliance process. And in Boeing's defense, there have been lots of planes who've crashed that have been independently verified by other inspectors. So, and in this, I will get to this in the presentation. It may be that Boeing's, statistical performance really didn't vary that much from other procedures. But nonetheless, they had this self-compliance approach. And so now the TAA deserves a good part of the blame.
Hmm. Is it at this point we can look at it from a government standpoint in terms of where it starts in terms of safety?
I think we're going to use, I had planned on using my frame, which starts with the economics broadly defined, greatest good for the greatest number, then goes to law, and then goes to ethics and virtue analysis. Now, when you talk about the so-called utilitarian approach, and you use the greatest good for greatest number, in my judgment, you get into a little bit of trouble because you could still emerge with a greatest good for the greatest number outcome by the procedure they use. If you take airline passenger fatalities, injuries, and so on, and you do the math, you find out that air travel is probably the safest method of transportation, passengers per mile, cost, time, you factor all those in, and the greatest number are getting the greatest good, or certainly a greater good, from airline transportation than automobile, boat, or probably train. Though there are, I think, maybe fewer statistics in that regard. But in any event, it's a pretty good deal, even if you count the crashes, which of course you have to do. But the issue here is one of risk tolerance. When a plane goes down with 200 people on it, due to pilot error or manufacturing defect, the consequences are far greater than it would be if a single automobile passenger is driving too fast. An automotive operator is driving too fast, misses a turn, hits a stop sign, and crashes the car and gets killed. That's one person versus 300 from a very serious mistake. But the risk tolerance of a mistake is very, very low for a single accident, so to speak. So it seems, at least to me, that we have to take a look at our next two approaches, the second of which is law. Well, law gives you what is called sometimes in the lingo and the parlance of this kind of situation, an off-ramp. In other words, we just say it's the law that you have to have so many entrances, pilots have to receive a certain amount of training, you have to do this, you have to do that. It's an off-ramp. It sets forward the requirements, and if you've complied with it and bad stuff still happens, you may be, to a certain degree, though never completely, off the hook, so to speak. But there really wasn't a sufficiently detailed off-ramp, so to speak. The second kind of off-ramp is what you call compliance requirements. Typical law, and I think that was true in whatever law governed this transaction, delegates compliance and enforcement to a particular government agency. That agency, in turn, has compliance requirements, such as training, such as independent verification and inspection by that particular agency. The law delegates that authority, that responsibility to those particular agencies, and it did so here. And this is how the TAA decided to comply with them. So it seems like the off-ramp is not available to us here. So the core problem become in terms of future conduct is certainly we can do those compliance and we already have the law, so that we can certainly do those things, have training requirements and so on, and inspections. Perhaps they were mandated here and just were not done. But then we get to the third thing, which is the ultimate core of most problems, and most solutions, and that is the ethics virtue situation. I should say, with respect to law, we can even go further. We can do what is called building fences around the law, which is to say, you not only have to comply, but you have to inform us that you have complied, you have to let us inspect, and so on. And we will require additional changes upon careful consideration that may be required in your particular situation. So they didn't do that either. So now we're at ethics virtue, and it gets us back to the old aphorism, which actually comes from the Talmud, which has been often repeated in many situations. You are not obligated to finish the work of perfecting the world, but you are not free to desist from it either. And you will recall when we discussed, I think the Constitution, that was on the minds of the founders. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, recall that it's more perfect. We're just perfecting things. We're just improving things. We can never form a perfect union, but we can make things better, and we have to continually strive to do so. And we do so at the organizational level, through management, through executives, through shareholder oversight, the board of directors. And we do so in the case of individual conduct. 19 employees felt themselves sufficiently virtuous, sufficiently empowered, sufficiently knowledgeable to complain. So we can't entirely accuse Boeing of running a police state. They had people who were willing to call attention to problems, just that they didn't pay attention to those problems once they were brought before them. So that is where the whole thing usually begins and where it winds up. And sometimes in between, you have some observations you can make with respect to greatest good for the greatest number and law, but sometimes you can't. Sometimes
Now,
you just have to do better with what you have.
Ronald, looking at all of this, in your opinion, when it comes to ethics, and that's what we always center on or come back to, what's your feeling on the way Boeing is handling or has handled their situations in the past, looking through an ethical lens?
Well, use the plural here. I can only address this particular issue. And I would have to do it in comparison with how competitors dealt with. I mean, there's a widespread commentary now and has been for several years about how, you know, who are the constituents for a company? Who are the people who count the most, or at least deserve more of a say than they already have? The customers, the employees, the senior management, the shareholders, and then there's the duty they owe to the general public, because that plane, those two planes, the earlier ones, crashed somewhere. The people who were on the ground were not customers. They might have been incidental beneficiaries because maybe the plane serviced that particular city, maybe it didn't. But there's the general public as well, and that gets into the question of whether the mix is in balance or not. Clearly, when something like this happens, someone bears a cost that is of greater proportion than the degree to which they contributed to the problem.
In your opinion, and this final question, we're just about out of time. Looking at all of this, and I know that you keep this on your radar, is the airline industry in some serious trouble right now?
Well, I think it's a very bad patch, and it'll take a while to determine just how serious the trouble is. The pandemic, they laid off a lot of employees.
Do you think that has a lot to do with the oversight, if you will, like missing bolt on a door?
Yes, because at least conceivably, maybe not in this particular situation.
Sure.
Because they laid off a lot of employees. They rehired, they didn't rehire all of them. As a matter of fact, they rehired not a terror. It varied from situation to situation, but it was never 100%. It was never even, I don't think, 80% in most cases. And so in this case, should they have rehired more people? Even if they rehired the right number of people, did they rehire the people they should have rehired who knew about bolts?
Well, yeah. It's just every time I look at headlines, I was reading yesterday, Southwest, their challenges continue. You know, some of the airlines, and not the smaller ones, some of the, intermediate ones are at risk of bankruptcy. Scary time. And, ultimately we pay the price. Ronald, thank you so much for joining us today. And
my pleasure. Nice talking to you.
Something really important that needed to be discussed. A lot at stake here, not just financially, but lives as well. And looking forward next time we get together.
So am I. See you later.
We'll be right back.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you now have even more ways to listen live. Check out the MyTuner Radio, online radio box, and Simple Radio apps on iOS and Android, or find us online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com, or search Podcast Business News Network on streama.com and onlineradiobox.com/US. Take your podcast on the go and don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house.
And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned.
This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.